Yep.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining. So we are here to discuss around the topic on how do we prepare ourselves for the end of the SharePoint 2013 support. We're going to be discussing some of the best practices and strategies around that area. The discussion will first take place and the presentation will take place with both the Peters talking about the topic. We'll take Q&As at the end. So let me introduce you to the speakers. We have Peter Philip, who's basically our director of sales. And we have Peter again, who is the director of Microsoft delivery. Over to you, Peter.
Excellent. Excellent. And appreciate everyone joining us on this beautiful Wednesday. I'm really excited to talk about the SharePoint 2013 end of support with you guys. I know it's a hot topic for anyone using SharePoint 2013. There's a lot of questions around what this means for their different organizations and how to handle it. So we'll be going through a pretty extensive list of questions today and look forward to any questions from the audience as well. Everyone can see my screen right now? Perfect. All right, so just a little bit of an agenda here. We're going to start off with, obviously we did the welcome and introductions. We'll meet the speakers. So Peter and I introduce a little bit about Quiz for those who aren't familiar, and then get right into the webinar and spend most of the time on the conversation around SharePoint 2013. Finish off with some offers for the attendees and any Q&A from the audience as well. So as always, if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to throw them into the chat. We're definitely wanting to keep this very interactive and want to make this as valuable for everyone joining as we can. So if you have anything top of mind, please don't hesitate to shoot it into the chat. So just a brief intro of our speakers today. So my name is Peter Philp. I am the Director of Sales here at Quiz and Provision Point. Been working in tech sales for 5 years with a big focus on helping customers achieve their objectives using both software and services. If you have any sort of follow-up questions or want to discuss this topic further, you can see my email there, pphilp@quizcom.com. Also throw that in the chat. Would love to speak with any of you that want to dive into this further. And Peter, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, so my name's Peter Badley. I've been working with SharePoint and wider Microsoft technologies for about 20 years now, initially working with organizations in terms of how they implemented SharePoint on-prem, and then how they've migrated across to the cloud and adopted technologies such as SharePoint Online, Microsoft Teams as well. So I work with organizations of all shapes and sizes in terms of either how they move what they've already got to the cloud, or if they're actually just starting off their journey, how they maximize their use of the Microsoft collaboration technologies.
Excellent. All right, so just a little bit more about Quiz. Quiz is a software and services company that offers solutions for governance, workflows, provisioning, forms, org charts, calendars, pretty much everything that you could possibly need in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. We have solutions to make it easier to use, either through working with our professional services team like Peter to optimize your environment, or through software that we built over the past 15 years to provide a seamless experience on many of the Microsoft products that all of you are using. So as I mentioned, we have a highly experienced professional services team that assists companies around the globe in completing migrations, audits, and optimization projects, which will be the focus of our webinar today. So we're working with plenty of organizations on these type of projects involving moving off SharePoint 2013, whether it's to 2016, 2019, or to SharePoint Online. So again, if you have any kind of things that are rattling around in your head about how do I approach this, we have the resources to help you out with that if you'd like to discuss further. So let's just jump right into the question and interview here with Peter and I. Want to spend the majority of our time focused on that. Stop sharing my screen. And to kick us off, Peter, so obviously, as the webinar title indicates, SharePoint 2013 is no longer being supported as of April 11th. So we're already past that date. What does that mean for people using this version of SharePoint on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so without getting too technical, Microsoft have different flavors of support which they offer with their product. So there is a mainstream support where they'll offer sort of regular product updates, patches, and other things like that. And then they'll also offer an extended support, which is continuing to support the product, but primarily with security and critical updates. So SharePoint 2013 actually ended its extended support on the 11th of April. So that means that they are not going to release any forms of updates, any forms of security patches, anything else like that. People who maybe have a Premier support contract with Microsoft might well then try and might well have some additional support, but basically you're completely on your own. That doesn't mean that SharePoint 2013 will stop working, you won't be able to use it anymore. It means that if there's some security vulnerabilities or other issues which come about in your SharePoint 2013 environment related to the platform, you're not going to be able to get any support from Microsoft. You're not going to be able to get any updates from Microsoft.
Yeah. So you touched on the fact that people can continue to use it. I know that there's some people using even older versions of SharePoint than 2013 to this day, despite them being out of support. What are some of the risks associated with staying on an unsupported edition of SharePoint?
So I guess the first obvious one is around security. So if a new security threat emerges, then you will potentially not be protected or very likely be unprotected. Obviously, the information often people store in SharePoint, it can be quite commercially sensitive or even contain things like personal HR data and other things like that. Sorts of information which you don't want to potentially get exposed as a result of a hack or some other sort of security threat. So the first one is security. The second one is you're not going to benefit from any of the new functionality Microsoft are bringing out. They're not updating SharePoint 2013 or older versions like 2010. So you're not going to benefit from any new functionality. And also, as you potentially evolve other elements of your software within your business, the integration possibilities with SharePoint become less and less. So a good example of that is Microsoft Office. It may well be that you've moved to Office 2016 or even a newer version, or the Office 365, which you get included within your Microsoft 365 subscription. You'll find the integration touch points with those software, older versions of SharePoint get less and less. It's harder to actually get them to work together. And so you will lack all of those benefits. You won't get as good integration points. And you'll also find it harder to get stuff done. You know, there's going to be less resources available in terms of knowledge bases, guidance you can seek, and also resources as well. You know, whether you want to hire in external consultants or whether you want to employ people, it will be harder to find the right skill sets to actually continue to support and enhance an environment which is, you know, now is more than 10 years out of date.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point you bring up around the lack of expertise and the lack of guidance and knowledge that will be available. Because if organizations have, say, one person that is managing that SharePoint 2013 environment and is an expert on it, if they were to leave, there would be a real gap in knowledge of how to go about things. And then obviously with the lack of support, it'd be pretty much impossible to get any, further guidance from Microsoft without going through that migration. So I think that's a really good point to consider.
Absolutely. And also, if you consider the fact that many SharePoint systems contain business critical information, it might contain processes, templates to use as part of a sales process, key HR onboarding and expenses type forms, many key processes to an organization and key resources. It might also be the way in which you're collaborating with your customers and partners externally as well. So it's a very important system, and if you can't support it properly, it can become a significant risk to an organization.
Yeah. And obviously, as you mentioned, security is a huge factor when making these sorts of decisions. So if you are storing that critical business information in SharePoint 2013 or older, it's important to consider that you may be more at risk than if you took the initiative to move on to one of the currently supported versions as well. I think we've done a pretty good job highlighting the risks associated with staying on 2013. But obviously, there's a lot of teams out there that, as I mentioned, are using unsupported editions of SharePoint. So what would be some of the reasons that maybe teams would continue to use SharePoint 2013?
I think there can be a few ones. So one can be perhaps a lack of prioritization in the business. They may well have chosen to prioritize upgrading other systems or other, whether it's that ERP system or their CRM system or doing desktop upgrades or other things like that. So SharePoint just hasn't had the priority. Maybe it's not had the investment in the last few years. It's sort of that sort of if it's not broke, don't fix it type approach. It's doing the job for people, so they don't necessarily want to introduce change. There's perhaps not the budget in the business to actually go and make that change in the past. I think the other reason is there's potentially a lot of complications for some organizations to move away from a SharePoint 2013 or even older environments. Those environments were often heavily customized. So you'd have had quite complex branding done to those environments. You'd have had custom development, maybe delivered via solutions in those environments. And also you may well have made significant use of InfoPath, which is people use for sort of forms processes, HR, order processes, other things like that. So there's probably a significant investment for many organizations in the SharePoint 2013 environment. And they actually just, for whatever reason, either haven't got the budget or the desire to move away from that. I think the other thing is maybe they've not got the skills. So they maybe will have that one person who really understands their SharePoint environment, but they understand their SharePoint 2013 environment, and they may be less familiar with newer versions of SharePoint or even the Microsoft Cloud as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously in situations where you don't have that internal expertise to move off of SharePoint 2013, or it just seems like too big of a project, there's always other avenues like our professional services team, for example, that have the expertise to really move you on to the newer version with as few kind of hurdles and headaches as possible. Yeah, absolutely. So for teams that are looking to make that move, Peter, as you mentioned, it can be a big project, a complicated project. What would be a great first step to start preparing for the migration to a newer version of SharePoint?
I think you need to get a good understanding of what you've got at the moment. And often SharePoint environments have gone through a lot of evolution. And it may well be that the people who were originally involved in the implementation of your SharePoint 2013 environment no longer work for the business. They may have moved on to another role, or it might be that you engaged external consultants in it previously. So I think you need to get a good understanding of what your SharePoint environment looks like. And that's multi-componented. So that includes the underlying infrastructure, the Windows servers, the SQL databases which run it, the actual SharePoint architecture around how your sites are structured, any custom functionality which you've deployed like forms or developed solutions, and then also just the general usage and storage and how much data you're talking about. And I think once you've got that understanding, it's also very valuable to maybe do some engagement with some key users and key stakeholders to actually understand which elements of the system are actually still being used, because you may have a SharePoint environment of 2 terabytes with thousands of sites, but actually you might find that only a small fraction of that is actually really important to users moving forwards, and that's the bit which maybe needs to be moved away, and the rest of it can be archived.
Yeah. So also looking at that migration project as an opportunity to clean up what the SharePoint environment does, what it holds, and maybe make it a bit more streamlined by getting rid of redundant information, sites, etc.
And I think that's where you get a successful project, because then you're engaging the users and you're delivering something to them which is valuable, and you're enhancing the bits which are relevant to you. Whereas often in an organization, a purely IT upgrade project is much harder to sell within an organization, because you're trying to get people to buy into just merely a technical upgrade, and you need to deliver some value as part of that as well.
Yeah, and I know that oftentimes we hear that a lot of the complexity in SharePoint 2013 comes around the InfoPath setup and the fact that that's not being supported in the future. Could you maybe provide a bit of advice on what teams could look to do to make that InfoPath migration a bit smoother, or what their options are around that?
I think firstly, it's about understanding which forms are being used. So I've worked with quite a few organizations recently, and they're actually understanding, are all of your forms being used? Often there are info path forms in your environment which are no longer being used. So actually understand which are the ones which are really critical to the users. And then I think secondly, understand the complexity there. So it's not just about the complexity of the form, the logic in the form, but often people have implemented workflows as well. And the direction moving forwards is to use other technologies for workflows as well. So I think there's a lot of assessment. And then it's about identifying an appropriate tool to replace InfoPath. And there's different options. There are some options which Microsoft make available with things like Forms and Power Apps. Quiz actually has its own Forms app as well. And there may be actually other avenues, such as perhaps it just needs to be moved across to a document. So I think it's about assessing the whole forms estate and then identifying where there are those critical forms still, which do have that key degree of difficulty and complexity. What's the best platform moving forwards, and how significantly do you want to invest in a forms package? So I think if you built a number of quite complex forms, then you should seriously look at an alternative solution such as quiz forms to replace that, because things like repeating tables and conditional logic and rules in InfoPath are quite hard to replace with a new form Microsoft technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's been a big driver. A lot of the projects that we're seeing with quiz forms is people looking for that InfoPath alternative. So that's been a really interesting experience working with those teams to help get them off of InfoPath using quiz forms, which are extremely intuitive to set up if you're familiar with InfoPath. So obviously a big piece of the decision making in a migration project is what you're going to migrate to. So any key considerations people should take into account when deciding between moving to another on-prem version of SharePoint or moving to SharePoint Online?
My default approach is always online. I think for the reasons of it's the platform which is going to be most regularly updated. Microsoft are going to be bringing things to online much sooner than on-prem. That's been a clear direction for them for many years. You're removing the headache of managing server infrastructure to support it. So online is always my sort of default option, and you will naturally have more skills available in the market with online. That's not to discount on-prem altogether, because Quiz works with customers with on-prem and online editions of SharePoint. So I think the default option should always be to consider online, and can you deliver it online? There are reasons why organizations perhaps aren't quite ready for online. They might not have the setup with things like Active Directory and Exchange in place. They might not even have a hybrid deployment in place, so they can't really use the have the underlying services in terms of authentication and email required to properly take advantage of online and make it work for them. The other reason might be that there's already been a significant investment within the organization in server infrastructure. So maybe you've got a new data center, or you've got an agreement with a third party where you've already invested in all of that. So actually you want to take advantage of what you've already invested in, and you want to continue to move to on-prem. The other reason is sometimes, and not always, a move to a newer version of on-prem might be simpler than moving to online. If it's just upgrading an environment, and it's not too complex an environment, then actually it's a relatively straightforward piece which is done at database level to then upgrade that, and we'll move it across to new infrastructure and upgrade it. So sometimes it's easier from a pure IT support, especially if you're under a significant amount of pressure. Typically, a migration to online is always a migration. There's not an upgrade path. So there's an element of rethinking a little bit around what you're doing. I would argue that rethinking gives you maximum value. But if you're against a time pressure of we need to get off an unsupported version very quickly, people might choose to do an initial step of maybe upgrading on-prem before they move to the cloud, again, dependent on timelines, organizational pressures, and things like that.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, taking into account the urgency around the project and what you're able to complete given the strict timelines, or if you don't have a strict timeline, right? So you can maximize the effort that you put into it. So there's obviously, with any project, there's usually challenges. What are some of the key challenges teams typically face when going through a migration?
I think we talked about one of them previously, data and cleanup. A lot of organizations embark on trying to move perhaps too much data, either that's an upgrade on-prem or migration to the cloud. They don't go through that cleanup exercise. I've seen so many organizations go, oh, we'll clean it up after we get to the cloud or after we upgrade, and it just doesn't happen. So I think you need to make sure that you go through that upgrade process, so that cleanup process before you do any migration, because then it reduces the size of what you're trying to tackle. I think the second challenge is often skills. You might not have the necessary skills and expertise, and so putting the right team together to get that, might make that migration successful, is another key element. And then I think the third one is actually thinking about what that outcome looks like. What does it look like once you've got to the new version? Because typically, whether you've moved to online or you've moved to a new version of SharePoint on premises, you would often have a new experience. Things will work a little bit differently. You'll be delivering and structuring things in a different way. Users might have slightly different experiences when they're accessing it. So managing all of that change is really important, and doing it in an effective way as well. So I've seen a lot of organizations who pretty much end up with a SharePoint 2013 environment in online, or a SharePoint 2013 environment in SharePoint 2019. And you're not necessarily taking advantages of the changes and enhancements Microsoft have delivered. So what's the point of doing the project? So you need to make sure that what you're doing actually can deliver some value, but also that users understand that as well.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And I know we touched on timeline a little bit, and there's lots of variables that impact the timeline with a migration. But do you have like a sense of how long it would typically take to complete a migration from SharePoint 2013 onto one of the other editions?
That's a really hard question. So I think the one thing to say is it can take anything from 3 or 4 months to 12 months to complete a migration project. Again, dependent on the scale. I would think that the reason I gave that sort of estimate is I would think most organizations who are on SharePoint 2013 at this point have got a relatively complex environment. Anyone who had maybe simpler environments would have already moved across. So I think having something which is, there will be a complexity here, and that's why it typically takes longer. I think the variance of, because 3 to 12 months is quite a big deal, and the variance tends to be about the amount of data you've got, the resources you're going to put behind it. So how significantly are you going to put more resources behind it to make it successful? And also the level of change and planning you need to put in place beforehand. If it's a relatively simple upgrade or mapping process to online, it can be shorter. Whereas if you've got a lot of things which need changing, like info path, custom development, other things like that, that naturally takes longer.
So it depends.
It does depend. It's a terrible consultant answer, but it does depend. I think the one thing is go in with your eyes open. So don't go in assuming that it's something which you can get done in a few weeks, because it's not.
Yeah, and I think a key thing that's important to take into account too is that internal communication around timeline, right? Because obviously there's always people in an organization that want to set a timeline without maybe understanding all of the data that needs to be moved, all the complexity around it. So being realistic with those internal stakeholders is something that we've seen work well to prevent kind of frustration around the project. You want to make sure you set up the proper expectations early on, and a key piece is that initial kind of taking into account all of what needs to be moved and also what doesn't need to be moved, because that can really help to accelerate the timeline.
Planning again is key. So we talked about, what is one of the first steps people can do? Well, one of the very first step is understanding what they've got. And the second one is planning how they're going to get to wherever they want to go as their end state. Well, actually, second is planning their end state. Third is planning how to get there. And you need to do all of that work before you start doing anything, before you start installing a new server, or you start setting stuff up in online. You need to get all of those steps done first. So you've got a clear plan in mind of what you're going to do and how you're going to get there.
For sure, for sure. And you mentioned this earlier around getting input from stakeholders across the organization in terms of what they need in the new environment, what they don't need. Are there any common key stakeholders that you see that would be like you would recommend teams reach out to and involve early on in this process to set themselves up for success?
I think you tend to find that the big users of a SharePoint environment often are things like HR teams, marketing communication teams. Those are particularly heavy users. You may also find that something maybe around your business process, so maybe something like an ordering process or something else like that might be quite fundamental. So you may well find some other operational teams often use it. If you've got things like legal and compliance teams within your organizations, again, they've often do use heavy use of SharePoint, as well as teams like finance as well. So I think those sort of key back office operational teams are often the ones you want to focus on the most.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And thinking about the IT team, there's obviously different skills, different people have different skills within IT. Are there any kind of key skills that you need to look out for or to have on your team to ensure a successful migration?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're going to need a project like this needs multiple skills. You are going to need someone who's got expertise at the sort of back-end server environment level. So people experiencing Windows Server, SQL Server, potentially SharePoint installations as well. So that, the SharePoint administration components. That might be the same, that might be different resources. You're also then going to need someone who's got more experience on the sort of front end of SharePoint. So how everything's set up in your SharePoint sites, how they're secured, how they're configured. Thirdly, if you're using things like forms and workflow, who set that up in your environment? Again, it might be the same person, or otherwise you might need some expertise and experience around forms and workflow. You'll no doubt need someone on the project management and potentially business analyst side of things as well, in terms of scoping requirements and managing communication with the business. And then finally, for me, a really important component is adoption and training. So I think you need to think about where that slots in. Not a lot of organizations have that component within IT, so they may need to, again, rely on external resources. So quite a team made up of multiple parties, I think, is essential in terms of deep technical knowledge, SharePoint knowledge, project management and operations, and then sort of user adoption and training. And I think those are the 4 key components.
Awesome. And last question for me here before we move on to some of the offers that we have for our attendees. We've discussed quite a bit that's important to have stakeholders around the business bought in and involved in this project to set yourselves up for a successful migration. Obviously, there's always competing priorities around budget, around time spent. Do you have any recommendations for IT teams on how to get that buy-in at an organizational level for getting people involved in the SharePoint migration and convincing executives that it's something that needs to happen?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things there. So I think at the sort of lower level and mid-management level, I think doing things like key user interviews, establishing working groups so that you're engaging key stakeholders during the process. I think at the executive level, I think there's 2 key things to engage them on. One's obviously those security risks and data risks, which are becoming more and more important to organizations as we hear about things like data breaches, ransomware attacks, and things like that. It's becoming a big concern to senior management. But I think also the key thing is you need to provide them with a compelling reason on top of that. What's that extra business value? What are those key apps or processes or availability of information which you're going to make available to them, which is so key? And my final tip is sometimes it's really useful to find the new leader who's recently joined the business. Maybe someone new in the executive level who's recently joined. it's probably highly likely that they've worked with platforms like SharePoint Online and Microsoft Teams in their past organization. And they'll be a key champion for you because they'll understand the value, and they'll be the ones questioning, hey, why aren't we on the Microsoft cloud? Why are we on this old version of SharePoint? Why does it look so terrible? Why can't I access my information when I'm on, at the airport or, traveling or wherever I am? Why can't I access it on my iPhone? They'll be your key champions. So find those people who have had those really positive experiences of working in the Microsoft cloud, and they'll help you drive that value.
Yeah, I think the point around finding the new leader in the company makes a lot of sense because they might be a bit less ingrained in the processes and more open to change, especially if it's optimizing and making things better for them.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Appreciate all the insights, Peter. And as I mentioned earlier for the attendees, if you have any follow-up questions on this, feel free to throw them in the Q&A chat, or we're happy to chat with you one-on-one if you have some specific things for your organization that you want to discuss further. I'm going to wrap us up with just a few offers here. So knowing that this is a big priority for a lot of organizations, given that the end of life of SharePoint 2013, we're offering a free health assessment where we'll come in with Peter, myself, audit the existing 2013 setup, discuss whether it's upgrading on-premise or migrating to online, and provide some guidance around there based on some of the variables that we've discussed, and then deliver a report that would outline immediate risks, like any proposed new architecture, and a high-level migration roadmap of how you could get the first steps started. So if you are interested in hearing more about this or taking advantage of this, please feel free to shoot an email to sales@quizcom.com or my email, which I will send in the chat at the end of the webinar. Also wanted to highlight our partner Avalara, which is a great company that is offering free standard tax risk assessments for all of our attendees today. So this would include a guided Nexus questionnaire that can be completed at your own pace, some in-depth analysis of economic and physical Nexus tax obligations, as well as much more. So this is a really great company that we do close work with. Highly recommend checking them out, and we'll be happy to share more information if anyone has follow-up questions on Avalara. Okay, and that's it from us today. We are located in Mississauga at the Toronto Pearson Airport. More than happy to meet with anyone in the GTA area in person, or even if you're global, we can probably plan a trip out. We'll be in London, UK in a few weeks, so we'd love to meet some people there as well. Please reach out to us. We're always happy to chat. Our goal here is to drive adoption of not just SharePoint, but the entire Microsoft ecosystem. And we've been doing that for over 20 years. So lots of expertise here for everyone to take advantage of. And we hope to hear from you all soon. Nita, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, we have a few audience questions. One of the questions is, currently we have a 2013 farm with November 2022 update. Can we upgrade the SharePoint to the next update until February? What will be the best practice? Can we upgrade or keep it as is until the migration to the next version?
Yeah, so on that one, I think you're pretty up to date with your security updates. So it makes sense to fully patch to whatever updates Microsoft have made available for SharePoint 2013, especially as you're nearly there with those updates. So that gives you the maximum, assurance with where you can be for now. And then I think from there, plan in terms of where you're moving to. It may well be that you, again, it depends on the scope of the migration, but and how long you're looking at. But as you're so far advanced with your sort of patching and so well up to date with your patching, it makes sense to sort of complete that process. And then you're in a really great place to plan for whatever a migration looks like, whether that's moving to a newer version of SharePoint on premises or migrating to the cloud.
We have the next question, which says, what is the first thing to do to plan my migration?
Yeah, so that's why we've put together the health check, which we actually proposed. that would be my first step, is actually having a look at what's there. So, the previous question about your patching level, that'd be one thing which we would look at on the health check. We'd also look at a little bit more detail on the environment setup. But then we dive into, as me and Peter discussed, the overall setup of the SharePoint environment at the moment, the architecture of site, and look at any other custom developments and help you put together a plan for your migration. So that would be my recommendation in terms of the first step. Understand in a bit more detail around what you've got and where you want to get to.
Sounds good. We have another question from someone where they say, I have approximately 20 forms in InfoPath. What should I use instead?
Yeah, so again, I don't like saying depends a lot. So, and I equally don't like just saying use the quiz product. I obviously think the quiz forms product's the direction to go, but I think you need to have a look at what your forms are actually doing. So a lot of people used InfoPath to build quite simple forms, just 2 or 3 fields, very, very basic. It might be that you could replace that with just a Microsoft list, or if you move to the cloud, something like Microsoft Forms. I think if you're delivering more complicated forms with a lot of logic and data lookups and other things like that, then you should probably be looking at an evaluation of a tool like Quiz Forms. We offer free trials, so it's a great starting point. And actually, something like Quiz Forms has been designed as an alternative to InfoPath. So again, might be a good consideration in terms of where you've already got some skills. It's a shorter step than maybe moving to an alternative solution which is out there in the market. So first step would be very much looking at what your forms do, and then second step, evaluating some appropriate products which will be an alternative. And the good thing is with something like Quiz Forms, we support both on-prem and online. So if you choose to move to a newer version on-prem as a quick upgrade, then you can still use Quiz Forms. But equally, if you move to the cloud, we can support you there as well.
That's good insight. And we have the last question, which is, will SharePoint 2013 stop working?
So the good news is no, it won't stop working at all. You'll continue to be able to use it. It's just you've got to have those elements of concerns about some of those security risks which exist around SharePoint 2013 and the ongoing supportability. And if you're signed up to certain standards, ISO 27001 or other security standards your organization has to comply with, having sort of unsupported systems which are no longer receive patches and security updates is really, really important, and you need to move away from that. So no, it won't stop working, but that doesn't mean you need to move away tomorrow. But you should, if you've not already, you should be putting a plan in place around how you move away from that, because I think that will help with a lot of communicating and managing that risk appropriately.
Sounds good. Okay, I think that's it from our end. Thanks to all the attendees for joining the call. The recording of this meeting will be shared with all the people who have registered. And I hope you have a great day ahead. Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.